Welcome to today's special episode of Monarchism Unfiltered. I'm one of your hosts, McCosk,
This is me, Bronze,
This is me, I am.
but
and
this is no normal episode. For the 10th, I think, I hope, episode of the show, we'll be doing a very special thing where there are other people in this voice chat who, through the show, will be asking us questions that we will discuss. So, the person, for those viewing who don't know, they will be unmuted, they will ask their questions, and then we will discuss that question.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
So
if
that's
if there are any questions, fire away.
yes,
I'm not sure about it, but I think when people join in Discord, there will probably be a pinging sound in the recording, which might or might not be annoying.
yes. Also,
We'll see. If it is too annoying, we'll try to fix it in post, but we'll see.
also,
Yeah, I
indeed,
mean, we can give list the listeners later experience.
yeah. Also, now now the fans that are here and the listener too knows that this is recorded via Discord.
I mean, what is that going to do? Like
I think most of them could figure that out. Anyway, so while we wait for the questions to roll in, how
Yeah, we have like two people who've been writing them for a while. Well,
I think we can briefly, I don't know, give thoughts on social distancing.
this is
And
a prime example of it.
yeah, well, I mean, this is how we socially distance. We do podcasts.
yeah. I mean, social distancing is hilarious in some levels because like the horror stories I've been hearing of people either following them or not following them are a treat.
Yeah, I
Like,
mean, there's the infamous case of the Derbyshire police who used drones to monitor people taking walks in the Peak District because the length of those walks was considered by the police to be unessential. So they, because for those that don't know, the Peak District is a national park in the north of England. That and people decided, yeah, well, how do I get away from people? I'm going to take a long walk in this wide open national park where there are very few people. But the police decided that if you take a walk that's like longer than 2 hours and you get very far from your house, that walk is no longer considered essential, and so they used drones to monitor those people. It's pretty
drone, stri-
ridiculous.
drone striking people who walk too long. In any case,
Very
first,
American. Um, should we? I think we should discuss the question of specific dynasties rather than and like inter-monarchist cooperation, because I think this also then extends into issues around nationalism, because as far as I can tell, um, actually, sorry,
yeah,
should
first we need to unmute him. Yeah,
yeah, sorry.
sorry, this is new to us as well.
Hello.
Hell,
Hello.
okay,
So what is your question?
yeah.
So my question is about royalism in how far should monarchies cooperate or support their own favorite dynasty or the one they see as the most practical, etc.
Yeah, so I actually have thought about this a lot, because I think oftentimes the question of dynasties usually ends up being just a kind of it usually ends up being just a case of what or almost, yeah, it basically, it's just a question of like what political principles you believe in most of the time. And I think the most obvious example of this would be France, in that who you support, Bonaparte, Orleans, or uh, like legitimism. is basically just like its political barometer. It's just a case of, are you like progressive, are you Bonapartist, are you constitutionist or Leonist, or are you legitimate, like reactionary, quote unquote.
So, like, what type of monarchy you support very highly influences who you support. And so I think that then it comes down to, yeah, I mean, you should be like as consolidating as possible to, have like a broad appeal, but you shouldn't go so far as to like compromise your core ideals.
Yeah, there's like you see this like comparing dynasties to political parties is a bit wrong, but you see this in some political parties where they try to be so big tent that they just lose any kind of meaning. And there is a value in trying to bridge the gap and bring all monarchists together, but more often than not, like just keeping to your core appeal also has its victories.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a I think you can see this more broadly in nationalism than really you can see in monarchism, but obviously the two overlap quite a bit. But like very often, the issue in any kind of radical politics is the issue of sectarianism, where, and I mean, you see this most clearly with, say, Trotskyist sects, where they you know, I think the Fourth International in South Africa had 4 members. So the Trotskyist organization had 4 members, of whom there were like further subdivisions, essentially down to like 1-person subdivisions. And you see similar tendencies in nationalist circles, and historically you see the same sort of thing with monarchy, but you don't, obviously it's not, we don't think about it so much because of the smaller nature and more marginal status of monarchist politics as such. I would agree with Bronze generally that I think the most important thing really is it's not to try and do this anti-sectarian thing of, we're going to make a larger appealing group that's so broad tent that it just ends up being like a nothing, essentially. Because most of the time what you end up doing then is, if you're at any relevant scale, you'll end up becoming affiliated to some kind of tribal politics, which is usually like, it's a long death road then. And if you're at a smaller scale, usually you're just then another sect. And that's the primary issue that I see with pretty much any kind of radical politics. And monarchism, I think, does show it even to a greater degree, because there's not as much unification, so people can have like very different ideas and whatnot.
I mean, I think that answers his question. Like,
Let's go on to the next one. So, Inky had a question.
unmute him. Oh, no, he okay.
Yeah, hello, Inky. What is your question for us?
My question is, what could have Nicholas II done to keep the Romanovs in power in Russia?
That's a. We actually had a conversation about this outside
I
of
thought
the
about it
episode.
further though. I mean,
Yeah,
the quick
I think episode 6 for those wondering, decision systems in Russia, which that makes sense. Yeah, I am.
Yeah, I was gonna say basically his best option would have been just to give Stolyopin a proper bodyguard so that he doesn't get killed, and then like not enter World War One. Like I think that would have been the easiest thing he could have done, because Russia was not ready to enter the war. Entering the war could have only ended badly. He'd already compromised once in 1905, and so he was not able to compromise again, because people didn't believe him, and like he wasn't particularly willing either. I don't think compromise would have helped him. because I think if he'd proclaimed a new constitution in 1917, I think you still would have had the outburst of the Soviets, and then you basically would have just had provisional/dual government in 1917, but with a monarch, which I think would have just ended the same way, basically, because yeah, I mean, I think it's just the case that he needed to not enter the war or have Stolyopin,
Not
i.e. the
dead.
minister, yeah, not dead, basically. I don't know if other people would agree with that though.
I mean, it sounds about right. Like,
Yeah, but I mean, I also think that like Nicky, he was a bit ambitious. For example, I think there's a thing that not a lot of people know about, which is that in 1904 he actually got a secret deal from the Japanese that would have allowed the Russians to take all of Manchuria, but given all of Korea to Japan. But to his mind, that was an insultingly meager deal for the Russians, as he wanted Korea included into the Russian Empire. And so, due to that ambition, he sparked a disastrous war with Japan. And I think that's a common theme throughout his reign, that he was often just too ambitious. He believed very much in his own authority, which you think, yeah, it's fair dues. You are the Tsar of Russia. But sometimes he went too far, and I think he could have,
just take it and leave it.
yeah, just chilled out a bit, as we would
I mean,
say.
Manchuria. I mean, Manchuria is the most valuable part of North China. Wait,
It's not
that's
as good as
made no
it's not as
sense.
good as Korea though.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
and Manchuria was handed to him on a silver platter by the Japanese. They said, "Take it, go ahead, as long as we can have Korea."
Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean that's quite bizarre that he didn't accept that. I mean, I would have like.
I mean, but the issues I can kind of understand them. By 1904, Manchuria was already Russian. Like the
Yeah, I
the
mean,
rail
but-
the,
but
rail, the
you can,
railway go.
Yeah,
the
but you
rail-
can officially annex it. And
yeah, and I mean, and you know who brokered this deal? It was like the sole man who had the potential to save Russia, which was Stolyopin. Yeah,
Yeah.
and he got
Based king.
disastrously murdered. I mean, that there was the conspiracy that like Nicholas was it was a part of the murder, and but that's all complicated.
I'm
I
not
mean,
sure he would have been able to organize that though.
Yeah,
no, I mean, although Stolyopin had a lot of enemies, and it seems, and that the ticket for the revolutionary who went into the Kiev opera to shoot Stolyopin, his ticket to access the opera had been paid for by high-ranking members of the Russian court.
Okay, but that could be. I mean,
that
Yeah,
the
that could be.
Russian court. Where that doesn't say that.
No, I don't think
Like,
that Tsar Nicholas did it. I just think that's interesting that like someone.
I mean, that could even be Yusupov. Just like.
Yeah,
or-
no, yeah, I think it was Yusupov. Nicholas wasn't involved at all. But
So really, what
but
we've determined.
it was an effort by someone. It wasn't a lone.
Yeah, it wasn't a lone gunman. I mean, so what we've determined then is that what he should have done is you should have exiled Yusupov. That's the.
Yeah.
That's
Well,
the
Yusupov was suspected, but yeah.
I mean, Yusupov was a bit of a degenerate anyway. But his Oxford days are quite interesting. Because he just like hung around and sort of he bummed around and had a parrot and would like he would wake up at like 2 and like drink vodka in a like I think it was described as like a rug essentially. So that's like what he did. But the
Based, I think that.
yeah, I
That
mean
seems
it's very student life.
I mean, that's what happens at Oxford. That's just yeah.
Yeah, I mean the I think I mean that is quite interesting that you say about Nicholas being quite ambitious, because then that's quite similar to actually Wilhelm II, good old Willie.
Yeah, well, he was ambitious, and also he was a man who wanted to do everything himself. Like he
And was high on
micro.
cocaine.
Well, yeah, but that included everyone. Everyone at the time did loads of.
Yeah, I mean the Pope did coke at the
Yeah,
time.
Stoliopin, Nicky, the Pope, everyone was on it. You know,
Yeah,
it-
so like you can't really blame him.
no, I don't think that's it. But he was involved in provincial midwifery and like appointing midwives, and reducing the sentences of Stalin and Trotsky was something he did on repeated occasions. Which
Epic-based foresight.
yeah. I mean, there's a specific instance in 1913 where Stalin, who has just organized the Tiflis bank robbery, which was infamous, and 13 people were killed in the bank robbery, and masses, like I think multiple millions of rubles were stolen and funneled into revolutionary causes. And Stalin, the mastermind behind this plan, he was arrested, given 5 years exile in Siberia, and then first he was sentenced to death. Then the interior minister gave him 5 years of exile and hard labor in Siberia. And then the Tsar saw this and shortened his sentence to 3 years.
What? Why? Do we
And
know what?
I don't know why, but he was a big fan of like being merciful and shortening people's sentences.
But then also like hanging and like doing massacres.
Yeah, he hung a lot of people, but I don't know why that happened. That is very strange. And Stalin did not serve those 3 years in the labor camp. He escaped after. I think it was either a couple of months or a year.
Yeah, I mean, not very. I mean, I seem to remember that those labor camps were mainly used for like recruiting, more than anything else, and like organization.
Yeah, I mean the Tsarist labor camp system was very lax in strange ways.
Yeah. So let's speak to
I think we've
escalate.
gone a bit into
Yeah.
into
Sorry.
the weeds here. Although I think it is interesting. And if you aren't, I have plugged this book before. It's House of the Dead, the Russian exile under the Tsars, that details how and what happened and what a disastrous failure the Siberian program was in multiple ways.
Yeah. So next, I think we'll have the next question then.
So do we do Frank's ones or do we do Philip's?
We can go back.
Okay then, Philip it is.
Hello.
Hello. What's your question?
So I was wondering, what about monarchy makes it like extremely universal to the point where like every civilization at some point in its history has had a monarchy, with the it's usually on the basis of divine right and hereditary succession.
Well, the answer is fairly simple, and it's easy to explain on a, how am I going to put this, on on two scales basically. You have a monarchy that emerges from nomadic invasions, and you have a monarchy that emerges from extended familial ties. So, monarchy that emerges from nomadic traditions. Typically, nomads, especially we're talking like pre-Bronze Age, really, or really Bronze Age, if we really want to go with it, had a very concrete notion of private property. So when they invaded a land, the first thing they did was split it up into like their land and areas of influence, if you want like that. While the comparatively settled Bronze Age populations did not have a notion of private property. They had private property in common, etc. The notion of private property naturally leads itself into a notion of monarchism. One holds the land, one makes use of the land, and one passes it down to its successors. The monarchy that emerged from extended familial ties is the inverse. Basically, a family, due to what amounts to marriage, or also, well, I'm jumping myself. The first type of monarchies came from this, like from nomadic invaders, when they weren't theocratic. Theocratic monarchies emerged. There's a debate if they emerged themselves and then the religion came next, or if the religion emerged first and then gave origins to the monarchies. It's a bit out there, because the examples of we have these early Bronze Age monarchies, all of them are hydraulic empires, and hydraulic empires work better under single vision and single under single leadership, typically because a single person often is more keenly aware of what happens when you fail to maintain the canals, for example. So there's that. The clan-based monarchies are much more easy to us, and typically these happen when the notion of private property is already comparatively well established. And what happens is basically through marriage alliance, accumulation of wealth and property, and sometimes legitimacy via claiming ancient lineage and dynastic and this is and basically claiming mystical power towards itself. These monarchies came into fruition. Religion also played an important part in shaping various monarchies throughout the planet and how they work and how they functioned. But generally speaking, monarchism is a good system when you need long-term, when in order for your country to not collapse, you need long-term concerns. So, for example, maintaining dams and generally hydraulic empires. B, when unity of vision gives more dividends than lack thereof. So, in communal-based systems, a society that has unified vision and keeps it long enough will naturally lead and give better results than a society whose leadership is constantly changing or is constantly bickering in amongst itself, as was the case in early republics and oligarchies.
Yeah, and it's a case of the old adage: any diet works as long as you stick to it, as it were. If you have a monarch and he has a vision, like no matter what the vision is, it's usually gonna end, unless he has just a terrible vision, it's usually gonna end up outperforming a bunch of competing visions, because then none of those will be realized.
Yeah.
And so that's why power sort of has a nature to concentrate into someone. And then as for the part about divine right, once a man or a few men, usually men, have concentrated the power onto themselves, they need some sort of legitimacy in order to keep onto that power, to make sure that people have it in their heads that their vision, their specific vision, is the right vision. And so they usually do this by tying themselves to some sort of deity.
Yeah. I mean, I think also the other reason, at least, if you look at the justification that people have given for monarchy, the other important one as well, related to Bronze's point about vision, is this idea that the monarch is, in a certain sense, apolitical, and that a monarchical society is, in a certain sense, beyond politics in a way that a republican or oligarchical society isn't. And this is basically what Plato's point is. Plato's point about why he considers monarchy to be superior to oligarchy or aristocracy, and democracy, is because monarchy is less political, essentially. And yeah, why he considers aristocracy to be better, because it's less political, where he thinks that monarchy is more. And that I think is basically that, plus that has been a very traditional justification, and why people move to divine right is this concept that the monarch is, in a certain sense, beyond ordinary human concerns, which is why we've seen that generally great empires usually will end up being monotheistic or monolatrist, or
Monist in the case
Yeah,
of China.
monist. Monist is actually the best term. Sorry, because that monist includes then the Roman Empire with the one. The Stoics were pantheists, which then covers the epigeny, i.e., the successors to Alexander, and obviously China is good examples then.
Also, for those of us less literate in philosophy, philosophy and theology, monism or monist refers to a belief system that no matter how many individual elements it manifestates, has a single central point. This is distinct from monotheism, but it are both very related. So basically, when we say monist, think a religion that no matter what its trappings has a core principle or originative principle.
Yeah, so in China, this is heaven. So
Yeah.
that's the whole point of Mandate of Heaven, or even Tao and then things like Dharma, Brahman in India, and those sorts of concepts.
Yeah. Well, I think this answers his question. Okay, so what next? Franks or tokens?
Yeah. So, Frank, what is your question?
Yeah. My question was thoughts churches you man are.
He's cutting a bit off, but I think his question.
Could you repeat your question? Because you're cutting a bit.
Yeah, sorry about that. My question was, since I know you guys are quite religious, I wanted your thoughts on churches being closed and stuff.
Okay, so due to the quarantine. I mean, in a way, it is an interesting question because, like, wasn't it kind of the justifications for the First Crusade that people were being prohibited from like having proper religious service due to the Turks, and now here we are in a quarantine with the churches being closed.
Well,
Are you saying the Turks are a plague?
We don't want any radical. I think the issue was at that point was that the Turks were preventing pilgrimage to the Holy Land. That was the thing.
Yeah, that was the main justification.
But I think what's interesting is that to give it some perspective is that often historic Christians, even saints, didn't receive the sacrament all that often. You know, Saint Louis is purported to only have received Holy Communion twice a year. And so I think that is very interesting because that gives us like this opportunity to reflect on what they mean in our lives and how we are spoilt by having like ready access to them. And so, but also I don't think that just because church is closed that limits our opportunities, because there's still like all the opportunity in the world, especially now that much of everything else is closed, to have this reflection, you know both in prayer and in reading the writings of the saints and so forth, to reflect on the sacraments and what their absence means for us.
Yeah, I mean, there's also the way in which people like Pope Francis have basically doing acts of collective prayer at the same sort of time at certain times, and you can tune in and watch services and so forth. So which is very common with a lot of cathedrals and a lot of services. A lot of priests are doing that. So I think there are people sometimes overestimate the degree to which it's hampering the ability for community or interaction with church hierarchy. Even, I mean, Pope Francis is obviously doing lots of things, and I believe the Archbishop of Canterbury is doing
Yep. He's also been doing a lot of prayers and live streams and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, because at the end of the day, they're also trapped, and it's not like they don't do things. So, they have to get something to fill their time with as well. So I don't think they'll be too upset
Yeah,
about
and I think and most priests that I've heard from, they still have their emails open. So if there's anything you need to ask of them, then I think that's still possible. And yeah,
yeah.
so
Yeah, I think
I think this presents unique opportunities because now that we're in the lockdown, everyone's sort of having an Ivan Ilyich type moment. Which the death of Ivan Ilyich is a book by Tolstoy, and it's not a very spoilery book, in which the main character suffers an illness and knows that he will die. And obviously, we're not going to all of us are going to die, but and so he sits at home and reflects upon his own mortality, and in that reflection achieves a series of epiphanies about life and its nature. And I think it's a really good book, and I think that during those current circumstances, a lot of people are sort of having similar experiences to what Ivan Ilyich has in the book, and so I think that's more relevant than ever. Like you know it's the thing that Blaise Pascal said of all the problems in the world come from man being unable to sit alone quietly in his room.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that, and I think as well. It's interesting the degree to which people who complain about the church being closed, at least in the US, are also like um, almost one-to-one the same crowd who are like now demanding for the end of the lockdown. And those are usually like political, like libertarians, essentially, as far as I can tell. So I mean that's something that's quite interesting, but yeah, I think that's our thoughts in general. Yeah. So another question.
Yeah, so I mean conclusion is, don't stop praying, watch the live streams, read, use this time to reflect.
Make use of your e-rosary.
Yeah. Or the regular one if you have one. If you don't, then you don't need the beads. You can find all the prayers online, and yeah.
Okay, on to the next question.
Yeah, so this is a question from Token.
Wait, am I on?
You're on. What
You're
is your
on.
question?
Fuck. What do you guys think about African monarchy or monarchism in Africa, whether it be northern or sub-Saharan?
Okay, that's an interesting question because in Africa, monarchism is like in Europe. If in Europe it's complicated due to an interlinking of historical factors and ideological factors and economic factors and all that, in Africa it's even more complicated because add on to all that I just said the factor of ethnicity and like the like you have like in some areas of Africa, monarchism takes on decidedly successionist ends in which it is a specific ethnicity or tribe that's trying to succeed from the post-colonial state in which they find themselves. Other times it's an opposition to, I don't want to say modernity, but sometimes there's also a religious underpinning on this. So like for example, I've heard that in Nigeria some support the emirs, well, the few emirs that remain Islamic, because a lot of them have converted to Christianity, as in a direct opposition towards Christianity in the south, but that is also related to ethnical tensions. In many cases, monarchism in Africa has this intense ethnic character to it that both helps it have a strong base, but kind of hampers it in its spread because it ultimately then becomes a question of ethnic supremacyism rather than ideological supremacism.
Well, I mean, the other thing here then is that very often the impetus for like actual like a monarchical state waxes pretty quickly because for whatever reason the monarch or the ethnicity become reconciled to whatever state they find themselves in, be that by way of bribery or economic development, or just like not wanting to fight a civil war, these kinds of things.
Official recognition, or special states such as paramount chief. There are many ways.
Traditional. The most common thing is like traditional leadership, and like people put this into the context of like, and you even find like left wing groups who will like end up opposing like not having monarchy, which is what the case is in South Africa at the moment with the EFF, where the EFF are like, we want to further support our chiefs and our kings because we want to have like an African democracy, and like to contest received notions of democracy in South Africa. And you see similar things in like Uganda or wherever else. And I mean that Mikoski, you know something a bit about Libyan monarchism, I think. Which
Yes, I'm familiar with Libyan monarchism. Libyan monarchism traces its origins to the Senussi order. In a hilarious turn of faith, I've heard Libya be compared to the Arab Prussia because the monarchy emerged due to a religious order turning secular in air quotes, in both for Prussia and Libya. And basically, the Senussi order became the House of Senussi, and this entire dynasty had its origin in Eastern Libya, also known as Cyrenaica, and therefore it's very strong there. And back in like 2012, when the situation in Libya was like stabilizing, basically during the first ceasefire, the one that lasted, not the one that was paper thin and lasted 3 seconds. The regional council of Cyrenaica just became like, either by luck or maybe Cyrenaicans are just that monarchists, just became absolutely filled with monarchists, and they started demanding that the monarchy be restored in full. Then the civil war picked up again, and everything went quiet. And I've heard reports that they're back at it again, and hopefully they succeed. But still, the Libya is a good example of it. There is a logic of regionalism on this. Different ethnicities. Cyrenaica has historically quite ancient and very urbanized, with its inland being almost completely depopulated, not having the like. They're literally a case, unlike the rest of Libya, where the tribes and the urbanites are separate. The urbanites and the tribes are the same people, and they all support the same cause.
Yeah, and I mean, so the usual thing you end up seeing then, especially where the monarchies do still exist and have a degree of power, is some kind of constitutional arrangement. So you have, I believe, you have constitutional arrangements in Uganda with the Uganda Kaba ship. I believe there are constitutional arrangements in Nigeria with their like, I think it's with the Caliph. I believe there's constitutional arrangements with them. I think there's also constitutional arrangements with some in the south. A lot of these are also because like these people were big landowners, and still are, and so they have a lot of weight and money to throw around, which is usually helpful. And I think the difference is actually with there can be like, obviously Ethiopia is a different case because it maintained an independent monarchy, and potentially like the North Africans who were also independent or semi-independent states where they had a degree of like a proper system rather than integrated tribal systems, and that I think has meant that monarchism in places like Ethiopia, Egypt, even probably like Sudan with the um, Mahdists, has meant that it's more ideological there as far as I can tell. And I mean, I think the if there was a place that I would guess in Africa that would possibly become more monarchical, would I would posit probably um, either, like, from what I know, South Africa, or maybe Ethiopia, just because of it seems that Ethiopia is increasingly moving away from its communist past, and that will probably allow for a greater consideration. So yeah, so I think the next question would be good.
Yeah.
Unless Bronze has some comments about African.
Yeah, no, that's fine. So, yeah, so the next question comes from Dwarven.
He has been unmuted, so he's only muted because he himself wants to remain muted.
There you go.
No, I can ask the question. So, in the United States as a whole, where would a monarchy more
Dwarven?
likely be able to thrive? The North.
I think he's
the
saying
South?
something, but it's so damn quiet.
How?
sorry.
I'm literally yelling.
Sorry.
Yeah.
It was on my end. Sorry.
Let me reiterate. Would a monarchy be more likely to thrive in the United States North, the South, or the Latin South, whereas like California, Arizona, that kind of area?
The ever popular question. Well, the issue here is that valid as that question is, I think we have to like level the playing field here, and I think the rest of the hosts will agree with me that a monarchy will only come to America after something terrible has happened to America, basically.
Are you suggesting that Trump is not already king? He has like declared himself king. Have you not seen this?
I mean, I don't know. I just don't like that my kings are rich businessmen. I think structural conflict of interest and attitudes there. But the base logic is this. Like, the Dwarven's question can be interpreted in two sense. Like, out of the box, America as it is now is extremely unlikely. Something terrible has to happen. Like, we're talking Fallout tire levels of Armageddon to basically happen upon it. Or, I don't know, a cataclysmic failing of the presidential government in such a magical way that it doesn't lead into either insano communism or turbo insano fascism. So, out of the blue, the question is there is no possibility. But
I mean, the thing is that something so radical would have to happen that with it would destroy the notion of America itself.
Yeah.
And so what that would look like is very hard to posit.
I mean, if you were gonna like just posit like where are they most likely to have monarchies, almost to the degree of like post-political calamity, and like the U.S. breaks up, I would say the Midwest, because there's a whole bunch of like, and possibly Texas, basically anywhere that has religious fundamentalists, I think is more likely.
Large landowners.
Yeah, large landowners and political fundamentalists, I think, are more likely to produce monarchies than the other region, because
Essentially, people with the means to consolidate power onto themselves.
yes, and like an ideology there that will justify it to a greater degree, because obviously the Bible, especially the King James version, is very monarchist. So I mean, if you want me to call it, I would say independent fundamental Baptists and King James onlyists are your go-to people for monarchism in the US, basically. I don't know if you would have other predictions.
I mean, if we're also going on an historical angle, we have the South is also, like, abstractly speaking, the South is also a good bet. I mean, during the American Civil War, the South, there was a group of people in the South that had their own newspaper, and they called themselves the Imperialists, if memory serves. I found this article over a decade ago, and I can't find it anymore. So if I'm talking out my ass, well, feel free to correct me, since this is me recalling information I haven't seen in a decade. The basically, these groups of people who saw the nation building character of the monarch wanted to create a Confederate monarch in order so that the Confederate States could have a national identity beyond just being in a civil war. So you have, and that angle, as obtuse or tasteless it might be to some, is still like a valid point. So it is hypothetical that any area of America that splits off in order to become less American could potentially adopt monarchism as a tactic in order to increase distinction.
Yeah, Dwarven would like to place a secondary comment.
And we would like to remind all of those here that you can ask more than one question.
Yeah, so go, ask away.
So, if memory serves me correct, President Davis of the Confederate States was actually openly endorsed by the Pope at the time, meaning that he probably would have had a good chance of achieving probably a Catholic monarchy, considering President Davis was a Catholic.
That is fair point. Thanks for the additional information. Your next your second question, you have to like say it.
No, I think the interesting thing about the endorsing of people during the American Civil War is that people saw in that conflict reflections of their own society. So, for example, Prussia, who was at the time centralizing their grip on Germany, supported the North because they saw in themselves saw in them the same urge of like creating this united structure, whether that be a Germany or the United States. While the Tsar also supported the North because he thought, well, I'm freeing the serfs, they're freeing the slaves. That's a fairly similar kind of narrative of freedom. Well, for example, someone from Bavaria would perhaps support the South because they were saying, okay, so there's this group and they are in the process of being unified into a larger polity, and I'm resisting against a very similar process. So who they endorsed doesn't actually have that much of a, and it doesn't go for just the American Civil War, of course. This goes for any of like how they felt about slavery or the Civil War in general, but more effects on how they viewed themselves in their own context.
Yeah. And yeah, Dwarven had a second comment about, I think, about economic system.
Yeah. But yeah.
So, in third world countries, what would be the most ideal economic system to push them out of poverty and into a more industrialized or developed state?
Well, we have an economist, so.
I'm not technically an economist, but I do have
well,
an
historian.
Well,
yeah,
I
you have an
have
economics degree.
yeah, I have an yeah. So I mean, that is an interesting question. It's a pretty big question, but I'll try my best. So I mean, what you have to look at then is what are the economic factors that affect third world countries. And so I think there are two major factors. One is outside influence. So that is what some would call Western neocolonialism. So that usually involves governments that that act that enforce anti-competitive standards that keep third world nations from competing, but it can also include large Western. I use Western as a byword for from the first world, not as a geographic term. You know, corporations that have exploitative relations with third world countries. And so because today we have corporations that are so large and so powerful that they are on the scale of nations. And so when it comes to, say, small, not that well endowed with resources third world nations, they can often be marginalized by large corporations. So and so they set up exploitative factories. And so if they try to change the relations, that is, the third world governments change the relations between themselves and the corporations, they often face feedback. The other thing is a lack of quality institutions, because people don't create wealth by themselves. Because if you want to set up a factory, what do you need? You need a lot of institutions to make that happen. You need a good school system that can educate people to like have the skills required to do those jobs. And that also requires a governmental system that is free of corruption. And it also requires, for example, if you want a factory, you need quality railroads and transportations that can access it. And so that becomes very nebulous, because you would think, okay, so the more endowed nations could give aid to the less endowed nations and thereby help them build institutions. But that often doesn't work out that way, because aid is quite complicated. You see, it does not just work that, oh, you give them the money and then good things happen. Because one, that money could be spent in a very bad way, enriching some government middleman, or 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 the despotic ruler of that country. And so to counteract that, Western nations often put clauses and riders along with the aid, but those often work very poorly, because they have the effect of not enforcing the interests of the people of that nation, but the Western government that gave the aid. And so I think the central step would be to solve the first problem. That is, create a system where large corporations are accountable for what they do. And so I think that has multiple layers. For example, that comes down to tax, that comes down to child labor practices.
I mean, the proposal that the Pope seems to be pro at the moment would be a global minimum wage, and like UN labor protection laws, because that would like help solve a lot of the issue of like cross-border like differences of like labor laws, which would help quite significantly, basically. And it would reduce like exit push on, say, like Mexicans want to go to America because Mexico's not all that good and pays quite low there. So then they move to America, but because they can't get in legally, they get in illegally, and when they get in illegally, then they get like paid little, like very little. So what you basically want, at least from the American perspective, is that you want wages for potential illegal immigrants to be higher in Mexico than in America. So you want it to be a waste of money for the person to move to the US, basically. And that would also then include like schools and whatnot, and like violence in communities. And I think that
Yeah, I mean, you have to even the playing field, because it's not just wages. Because here's the thing: is that if you were to establish an enterprise in a country, they often could not compete on the same grounds as a Western corporations due to things like IMF trade regulations and the WTO. And so that becomes complicated. And so I think the main thing is that, you know, you have to even the playing field, you know. And so I think an even, like a global minimum wage would be a step in the right direction.
Yeah, and I think that's part of why the Pope is quite pro it, because obviously he as well has to think about like, lots of different peoples, not just Westerns, basically. And yeah, I mean, I think beyond that, it seems that you know those countries that have done very well, like North Korea, which at independence was as poor as most of Africa, it's now much richer.
You mean South Korea?
South Korea, I mean, even North Korea is now richer than most of Africa.
Yeah, they were, but South Korea, I think, is more emblematic of the point you're trying to make.
Yeah. But I mean, anyway, both of them are notable in that they had strong anti-corruption laws. There is strong government over. Sorry, in South Korea there was strong government oversight of businesses, and there was like unified vision with the Syngman Rhee dictatorship, and so that combination of low corruption, government control, and direction led to very rapid industrialization and wealth creation, and then they became much better, and like then they liberalized. And now they're worse again.
To give an example of how hardcore South Korean industrialization was, one of the major metalworks in South Korea was at the start of South Korea's existence a clothier. Most of South Korean industry was clothier, and the dictatorship brought all the owners of these clothing industries and said, "You will now start making steel, or we will kill you." And they took the "we will now make steel," and steel they did make.
So I mean, it's like Hyundai was a textile company, and then they got forced to make ships. But and obviously that was like really useful, good, whatever. But I think
the main thing is that like they had a vision.
Control.
Yeah, they had a control, and they had a long-term vision, and so they knew what they had to do to build those institutions that were necessary to create that wealth.
Yeah, I would agree with all that. Who was next? Sorry, in terms of questions.
So that's Frank again.
Yep.
Yeah.
Hello.
Yeah. What's your second question?
My second. Uh, thoughts on tradition as family structures, especially when it comes to more of the online traditions that you like gaffs.
Well, so I think with like a lot of people basically take traditionalism to mean like the 1960s
Yep.
is the very like the most common thing. I mean, you see this even like the trad girl meme where it's like it's this kind of 60s aesthetic that
Yeah, the
she's
whole the whole the whole 2.5 children on a Labrador thing.
yeah instead of 2.5 acres and a cow. uh the so yeah, I mean the at least it like I mean that was a very I think the kind of 60s aesthetic that a lot of traditionalists are caught up in is like very cringe because it was an incredibly unstable social formation that only existed because of like the need to rebuild like from like the need to rebuild from like the Great Depression, World War and like World War II, and that's like why it came into existence. And it's like no one, you know, and it's also it's like this like it's very American, and so I always find it strange when you see this in like the UK because the 50s and the 60s in the UK were like really shit.
Yeah,
Um,
it was clean air acts. If you lived in London, you had a black lung, and there
and
was right.
you
Yeah,
ate tinned fruit like that was like it was
yeah.
black and
You ate tinned herring from South Africa and horse meat, and you. But I mean, so that what is interesting that describes the UK 50s is that the original Ian Fleming James Bond novels had spent a lot more pages on describing Bond eating than they did on him fighting, because that was like a way to live out your fantasy. Because he would go to northern France and eat oysters with mountains of butter. So that was sort of the fantasy of the British person of the early 50s.
that sound like oysters butter sounds
I mean, it wasn't specific. I don't. It was. There was
No,
in
no,
no
I mean
matter
I've
what.
seen that. I've seen that in Bond
yeah.
but
He ate a
it's
lot
like
of butter in those books. And like
yeah,
even
yeah.
like all the tense sort of discussions with the main villains were always over lunch, and because they had to fit him eating all these luxurious meals into the book. Well, not
Yeah.
they, but Ian Fleming, who and he would eat avocado, pears, and stuff. And I mean, what's interesting is that during this time, Ian Fleming was living in the Caribbean, in Jamaica, and gorging himself on avocado pears, and so forth.
Yeah, so live live vicariously through James Bond.
Yeah, that was the vicarious. It wasn't that he gets to ride fast cars or shoot supervillains and you know go to
yeah.
bed with.
I
Oyster and butter lifestyle.
Yeah, there was just
yeah.
you get to eat baguettes with butter. That was like his luxurious fantasy.
Also, everyone lived in like social housing that had been like thrown up in a month. And it was
Yeah,
like
I mean, and they had these sort of new cities that if you're in the UK and you've ever been to Stevenage, then that's sort of
oh
that's
god, I mean they're awful. They're all awful.
that's the world of the 1950s, and that's not
Cities made for cars, people.
yeah, Milton Keynes and so forth.
Yeah. Oh god, I
Yeah,
mean
yeah,
Milton Keynes.
yeah. Now we're just
Roundabout.
ranting about places we don't like. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's one big parking lot.
Yeah.
Okay, slightly sidetracked, but
Yeah.
the base idea is that traditionalism and traditional family relations in the internet are often stereotyped into just 1960s America, and that actually makes completely no sense.
Yeah, and not like what most people in 1950s America were living through either. Just like this narrow-ish middle class of white people in America that let that lived through this, and so it's not like a global, long time. It's there's nothing traditional about it.
Yeah, but like we like a baseline of what a traditional family is an extended family with, believe it or not, where the patriarch and matriarch of the family share authority. Like there is this whole idea that the woman needs to submit to the husband, and although that is set into the Bible, that's not necessarily what it's meant. In medieval societies, what typically happened is that you would have a division of absolute authority, the most stereotypical one being that the woman had absolute authority inside the house, the man had absolute authority outside of the house. This was the arrangement in Portugal, for example. Other countries had slightly different, but typically is same authority, different areas, basically.
Yeah, I mean, and I think to a certain degree, a lot of the issues with internet traditionalism is that the fetishism for a specific time period gets in the way of articulating a coherent set of beliefs about what society should look like. So then it's like, oh, this society should look like the 50s and 60s, rather than saying, okay, this is like, and it's a kind of mysticism in that it's like, rather than simply saying what you believe, you wrap it up in a symbolism. And I think that can be harmful for having a clear political program.
Yeah, the goal of a political program should be to create a better future, not to dress around and play.
Yes, I think Todd, you has a question.
Okay. Yeah. Unmute him.
Yeah. So Todd, what is your question?
I know we know you haven't finished writing it even yet, but come on.
I would like to ask you if you have anything against non-monarchist traditional state structure, like for example the medieval style theocracies or the Italian Republic, the Renaissance. Not in a sense of going out and making Germany a merchant republic, but in those regions which traditionally had those systems, if you would prefer implementing them over a monarchy, for example.
That
So
is
that's a really good question, and I think the answer to that question will be different in every place. So that's, for example, in Italy and the Italian style republics, is that something you want to emulate? Because if I were Italian, I don't think that's what I aspire to. Because a lot of people on the internet have this notion that some republics are good, like Venice, because they happened a long time in the past. But I think that, for example, Venice and Genoa and all these other Italian republics do share a lot of the problems of modern republics in that they were dominated by wealth, in the sense that the pursuit of money were their highest ideals, and I think they also suffered from systemic corruption,
in
which
Venice
is
is
why I think I would describe myself, and that's why I think my co-hosts would agree that to describe ourselves as monarchists and not blanket traditionalists.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, also like the Venetian Republic was designed to be corrupt.
Yeah, it was hilariously corrupt.
Yeah, I don't think so. I don't think that would be like an emulation worthy
It
model.
had, yeah. So I'll give you an example. The Venetian Republic had 42 layers of election. That is between you, Joe Blogg's elector, which is not the entire population, and it's not even qualified by money. It's qualified by the first electors are qualified by membership in certain guilds. Um, between you casting your ballot there, you being the apprentice or whatever, and the election of the Doge, there are 42 layers, if I remember correctly, near pre some reforms. So those systems were designed to be corrupt, and so I mean it's I would actually suggest you read Machiavelli's The Prince, because he also he has actually some quite interesting criticisms of republicanism um in The Prince, because he essentially considers it like incredibly easy to take, like he thinks it's almost trivial to perform like a coup against them or be authoritarian against like republics. And he meant that in general, and he gave the examples of like Venice and the Mamluks was his other example. But yeah, I mean I think on the point of other forms, like especially say medieval bishoprics. The interesting part, at least, of medieval bishoprics was they were monarchies. Like the bishops who ran a state were like they were monarchs. They were prince archbishops, and um, they existed also within a specific context, which is the Holy Roman Empire.
Yeah, in which and that's the whole Autonic system of auto appointing bishops to positions within the HRE to limit the power of princely dynasties.
Another thing to point out, and especially in the context of Italy, nice one, is a very important thing that happened in many South European countries, and in the north too, but the Holy Roman Empire was different, was the communal revolution, where the first cities started gaining autonomy. In Portugal and Spain, this was a less violent step, hence why it's not even referred to as a specific thing in Portuguese historiography. It's just a period of time when our kings started issuing fueros, specific laws and regulations to the cities, which functionally made them republics. So the question of traditional republics, especially when the farther we go back, is that, and I think this is very important, not only for discussions of monarchies, but also like discussions of politics, is that politics doesn't scale well. It's not that things that work well small work worse big. It's weird like that. So a lot of these smaller, like quasi-republican entities, these small new autonomous cities, were quite functional and worked perfectly well. And that's because democracy is a system that works well in a small scale, but starts running into intense issues later. However, as the rest of the hosts pointed out here, the Italian city-state republics were also comparatively small scale, and it all went wrong. So the base idea is that, and this is where my point is, just because the system is old does not make it good. We have to reflect on why it worked, why it didn't work, and the context in which it existed. And I think this is what we must take from here, is that all of the Italian city-state republics have capital I ignoble ends. Venice was sold out to the Habsburg by its leading functionaries. Genoa bankrupted itself out of existence. Tuscany cooped itself out of existence. Amalfi is so obscure, most of you don't even know Amalfi was a republic.
I mean, I think people know more about Amalfi being a republic now because of CK2.
You know what? Fair point. But it's the early start dates, and not everyone has that DLC.
Yeah, I mean,
class consciousness, guys. Gotta.
yeah. But yeah, I mean, I think the like, and the other point here is that all of these, both the medieval style bishoprics and the Italian style republics, they exist within the context of the HRE, and like the death of Matilda of Tuscany, and the emergence of the commune form and the power of the bishops in Germany was specifically in response to a series of political crises, and to a certain degree, it seems to me almost that we've gone from we had the Roman Empire, we had Charlemagne, this kind of stage of whatever big monarch, whatever big states with vaguely defined nationalities, to a period of kind of intense breakup, national constitution, and now it will be interesting to see if the European project of the EU works out, because also, I mean, there is the point that Kalergi, king that he was, did envisage the EU as a way to bring back the HRE, and Charlemagne. So it will be interesting to see if that does work. I mean, EU law is quite heavily influenced by the Middle Ages and by Catholic legal theory that like emerges from the Middle Ages, which is why it has like subsidiarity and so forth built into it constitutionally. So you might be able to see something like that come out of the EU, but it's looking less likely though. So
I mean, also another thing I want to chat about the prince bishops is that they were, in a way, the direct product of monarchical investiture, which, I mean, some that's a bit of like a breach of their authority to appoint bishops. So there is that aspect of the corruption that was in the church at that time, which made that a thing.
yeah, I mean, it's because obviously it was also there's
the whole point of having bishops as vassals is that you can appoint those bishops, and then of course that was of course correlated to simony, where those bishops would then sell their titles, which came with land, to other people, and so it had a lot of issues when it came to that.
And obviously nepotism, and I mean, I agree with you. Like, I think also it exists in it was a conciliarist world. So the way that the papacy works now, where the Pope appoints literally every bishop, like that didn't exist. Like, bishops were basically appointed from their locality. So it's not. I'm not sure that it can basically emerge short of like reunification with the Orthodox and like decentralization of the Catholic Church, unless you're talking about like, I don't know, some other kind of theocracy. I mean,
the only other type the only other type I can think of would be the Vatican itself, the papal states.
But again, they're also like technically a monarchy.
Yeah.
Where the monarch is also the Pope.
Yeah, but I feel like that's such an odd man out, as there can never only be one of those.
Yeah, true. Unless you get the good old Pope baby bug
schema, going on in. But no, I mean, I think it's fair to assume that, like, The vicar of God on Earth is kind of gets a free pass on classification. I mean,
I agree. Big up.
God knows it. The papal state's flag does not follow the law of tincture. So
Yeah, I mean it's like two types of gold. The
And there's gold on silver on gold on silver.
yeah, it's based. The I mean the most interesting thing about like theocracies today, with like obviously Iran is pretty much the only one that's like big theocracy, is that was explicitly an attempt to realize the Platonic Republic. That's like what Khomeini was trying to do, and he's fairly clear about this if you read his lecture series on this. It's like 70 pages, so that's fairly based, especially because he has some like interviews where he says like democracy as a whore and stuff like that. So you know, that's kind of Chad. But I'm not. Yeah, I think that's
Yeah.
broadly. I think that's broadly what I think of the idea of the Italian republics.
Yeah. No, that's
Yeah.
yeah. So next up is Frank. Hello.
Frank, your question.
If you're speaking, we can't
Shit.
hear you.
Hello.
Well,
Okay. Yeah.
his
So
connection.
so I'm just going to read out the question. Should cities be made for cars and public transport, like a revamping of transport?
The overwhelming response, I think, from everyone is a resounding no.
No,
Cities made for cars are atrocious and an insult upon God's earth.
Yeah, I think that especially in the 50s and 60s, there was this wave of the car is new and it represents this ideal of personal freedom, and so we will try to build cities around the cars. And so I don't think I don't think that has worked, because I don't think that cities designed around cars are good for cities, good for the rurality, or even for car owners. Because what it has led to is that it has led to these cities that sprawl out instead of having concentrated, city centers. Like, because if you look at, for example, cities pre late 19th century, where they still had city walls, they were forced to come up with more interesting ways of keeping the cities dense, because they had to fit it all within the confines of the city walls. And so I think that has, and that led to very human sized, very walkable, very alive cities.
Good example, a massive example of that is the city of Luxembourg. The whole city used to be a gargantuan fortress, and the bits that used to be inside the fortress are compact, but yet at the same time walkable and filled with activity.
Yeah, or for example, York has a lot of that medieval, many of those medieval streets that I think are very good. Contrasting, and we're going to return to this. Probably not. This is not episode's not the last time where we're going to rant about Stevenage. The thing with Stevenage,
Keynes.
don't remind me. They are very broad, and so one thing about Milton Keynes and Stevenage is they actually have a surprising amount of bike paths that but no one uses them because there's parking and roads everywhere. And so there's two major complaints against the car as a form of urban transportations. One, they, of course, they pollute significantly. But even if you could somehow make an unpolluting car, you would still be faced with the issue that cars are incredibly space inefficient. Consider for a moment that you have a car with one person in it. That one person is using up an incredible amount of space for himself. While if they were transported through bikes or rail, they would use up a lot less space each, and so you could move a lot more people through the city and have less congestion.
Yeah, I mean,
And when it comes to the rurality, because I know the question was about cities, I think rail, for one, keeps villages together because they have to be at train stations instead of sprawling out like miniature, suburban nightmare cities. But also, one, roads take up a lot more space than rail does. And so what happens is that a lot more of the nature and the scenery gets destroyed by roads, and they are much more expensive to maintain. And so I think that possibly we should, and I'm quite radical on this, we should take like deliberate steps against the car. I mean, like, because if you look at London, a lot of people were saying, oh, if you build more bike lanes, the city will become more congested, and that's going to be worse for car owners. But actually, the opposite happened to be true, because what happened is that more people got off the road, and therefore there was less traffic. And so I think there's people say that expanding rail and bike and other lower tech, more human scaled public transport, or even bikes are private transport, that creates less options for cars. And they say that this as like a drawback, but I think it's one of the primary benefits. So I would go as far as to say that you shouldn't have a car unless you have a specific reason to own a car. Like, for example, if you like for the delivery of goods, or if you are a handyman who needs to carry a lot of tooling and equipment, then you need a car. But if you're just some guy, probably you don't need a car as long as there's able public transportation. And so I think there is this trend in cities to make them less and less car focused. I think that's a good thing.
yeah, I mean, also, I will ultimately point out that the move towards street friendly cities and like very rigidly planned cities began with Napoleon III. Napoleon III was the first guy to seriously reorganize cities around having wide planned streets that laid the foundation for modern
Yeah, the
market
famous
use.
boulevards of Paris.
The famous boulevards of Paris, which are, because it was made by Bonaparte, is by definition not trad, and thus bad. So that, I think, is the official monarchist take, has to be that we must oppose the Bonapartists and their lives at every turn, including on the necessity for wide city streets.
We must return to tradition with a V and have all of our cities become medieval side street hellholes.
Yeah,
I mean, side streets are based, and because then there was this thing in Walthamstow where they destroyed a lot of parking and car surface area to create like walkable streets and like bike paths. And so a lot of people, in Walthamstow said, "Oh, this is going to be terrible. All the shops are going to close." But actually, the opposite happened. because now it was walkable, so more people were less scared to come to the shop. Well, scared might not be the right term, but I think cars have taken from us collectively a lot of public space, and I don't know that they merit that.
Also, I mean, I just know that from because I've lived in a city where I've walked everywhere, and I've also lived in a very rural area where I've had to drive places. Even if the actual distance to the shop is the same distance, I found if I can walk it, I'd prefer to walk it over driving, because there's a degree of effort actually in driving that is like annoying and
Yeah,
you
there's
don't
this
want to
thing,
do.
especially that new drivers do, where they spend a lot of time trying to find a parking spot right next to the shop, and so they spend more time trying to find that optimal parking spot than just taking a parking spot further away and walking to the shop entrance. That I think is really funny.
Okay.
Yeah,
That's enough car attitudes for now.
I feel very strongly about this. Okay.
I agree completely with Bronze, and I think if we want to be epic trads, we have to oppose the car in all its forms.
We must oppose the Bonapartist car conspiracy and their
Yeah.
attempt to destroy the modern city.
Exactly right.
Yeah, but not just the city, but also, I mean, they've wreaked havoc everywhere.
The real terror was not the guillotine, but the car.
I mean, the car has a bigger has
The rubber guillotine is what we should call it now.
Well, you hit it here,
A
folks.
noose made of tarmac.
Yeah,
You've
a
heard it here.
noose made of tarmac. Um,
You've heard it here, folks. First,
Yeah, so
Monarchism Unfiltered, officially anti-car.
I think, like, we should do like the Luddites, but instead of throwing, things into cogs, I think we should, start go outside and start tearing up the roads. Get a pick and just go for it at your local road. Just, in the name of traditionalism.
With a
exactly,
V.
exactly. Trad. Dwarven had a question.
I think yeah, he had a question.
Yeah, it's him.
Yeah, sorry. I was checking something. Do you think you, as in all the hosts, believe that solar-powered vehicles or Tesla's hyperloops or hyperlanes are going to become normalized in our lifetime?
I don't think anything from from Musk is like, especially his like weird fucking sci-fi ideas are going to become normalized. Solar powered vehicles possibly. I can see
Yeah,
like
I mean,
solar
I
powered
don't,
bikes.
I don't think that solar powered vehicles would take the form of like cars with solar panel roofs. But I think, like electric vehicles that were indirectly powered through solar is I think a possibility.
Bikes, I think, could be a good example, like electric.
Yeah,
bikes.
like you have like you have an electric bike and you have a solar
Solar
panel on your
powered
roof
Segway.
and you charge it at home. I could see that becoming fairly widespread. And I think
If
I think
batteries get small enough, efficient.
yeah, if because that yeah, and batteries are the central element to renewable power. Because the problem with power is that you can't store it in any sort of useful sense. So, for example, if you have a coal plant, if you run the coal plant, you can see how much power are people consuming, and you can burn the correct amount of coal. And so that creates steam, which powers an enormous multi-ton steel turbine. And that turbine has enough inertia that it can create an even amount of power, and you can adjust it very precisely to match the grid. I don't know if that is, I mean, I think that's a challenge that you have with, for example, solar, in that, the sun isn't always shining when the grid is using the most power. So you have to be in a position where you can store enough power that you can run a grid wholly on solar.
To
And
flatten the curve.
I don't think, yeah, exactly. I mean, you have to have an evenness of power because the sun is not even. And so you have to make up for that with battery storage. So current batteries are not there yet.
And that would be the big solution.
Yeah, so that, I mean, I know you love talking about Musk. He's built a mega factory that makes batteries. And so I don't know how that's going to work out for him. But I think he's onto that batteries are big. I just don't think he's doing it in a very reasonable way. As for the hyperloops and hyperlanes, I put very little credence into that. I don't think that's the future.
I mean, that's just like extreme cars essentially, because it's like super inefficient. Like the whole underground, like it's underground car systems. It's like super inefficient essentially. as far
Yeah.
as I can tell.
Yeah, no, I don't think that's it at all. I mean, I think the solution, because I think there's only so much that we can batteries. I think we have to meet in the middle. Power consumption has to come down for it to be reasonable at all. Because there's just a fundamental hard limit to how efficient batteries can become.
Yeah.
So I don't think that's why, like, for example, a lot of cities like Tokyo have these like low energy carts that run on loops so small with such regularity that they don't even need timetables. So I think walking, biking, and low tech, quite simple rail systems are the key for cities. I think the main thing, I think you could power it off of solar, but the main obstacle in that is that power consumption overall has to come down. And that means space efficient solutions like walking and biking, which also don't use power, and lower tech solutions. And I think we just have to move around less.
Also, and like that would also then require like building up. So like
Yeah, I think
less.
that cities are going to have to embrace verticality. But you have to make it in such a way that it is, sort of palatable. I don't think
And not
skyscrapers are it.
I mean, the real base mood would be something like a more hygienic Kulong, Kowloon, like block city, was it? That one square of land in Hong Kong.
The Kowloon walled city.
Yeah, the Kowloon walled city. Because supposedly people actually really liked living there because it was very communal. Like they were like they had a lot of community there.
You have that's actually incredibly common in a lot of basically in favelas in all like those kinds of places. People do live poorly there, but they live in a community that they often don't want to leave, and the fact that most government aid to these areas is just fucking gentrification. There is a tendency for the people in those areas to not even want that.
Yeah, I mean, because that's I think like a very important byproduct of building things on a human scale and not a car scale.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean now we're just that this is officially an anti-car show like that.
Yeah.
That's the whole topic.
God, King, anti-car, the motto.
God, King, bike.
God, King, bike. I mean, Charles would probably definitely agree with you there.
Yeah, I think. Yeah, I mean, I think he's doing a lot of and I mean because he's built this town of Poundbury, a sort of like an exponentiation of his ideals of what a city is, and that is very anti-car and tries to be on as human a scale as possible. So I think that's I hope people move in that direction because I know people who live there quite like it.
Okay. Next question.
Yeah, I think.
Yeah, I think,
we,
and I think
we
this
have
is going to be the final question.
Yeah, because we're
Yeah,
almost 2 hours.
we have.
Yeah,
we have
final
two
question
final
from
questions.
Todd
Yeah, Toddu and we have Toddu's and Token's question.
Yeah. So,
So.
we can do token.
Okay.
Hello, token. What's your question?
Let me put this in the most sensitive way possible. Why are so many monarchists LARP and cringe?
Quite sensible.
I think part of that is like the internet in general.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, we've done a special on it. Well, not a special because it's an episode.
Yeah.
Yeah, the LARP and the cringe. Yeah,
There
no,
might
I
be
mean,
a sequel to LARP and cringe. We never know.
yeah, very likely. Yeah, I mean, I just think it's a side effect of the internet. You know, like the LARPiest, cringiest stuff, like the scum, floats to the top.
Yeah. Even ye all the mad monarchist in his ancient blog criticized the monarchist. So the internet, due to its internal structure, is just a place where LARP and cringiness comes to the top.
Yeah, I don't think it's unique, but I also think, well, I mean, but you know, there's this thing that it attracts a very like particular type of person
Yeah.
who,
Like-
you know, he has not developed his analysis, and so, you know, he goes after the most sort of aesthetic, surface level,
Low hanging fruit possible.
yeah, and so creates this worldview that is not based on a whole lot, and so then it just devolves into LARP and cringe.
I mean, to be fair to the monarchist community, I mean, there's like worse ones, at least in terms of like I mean, you can tankies have like a lot of issues with like sexual abuse as well as like the alt right have
I mean,
that.
it's a thing across the internet is that the internet just sort of
Monarchist LARP and cringe is humiliating and annoying, but it's far from the worst type of ideological based LARP and cringe there is. I think is the point I am trying to make. Like, yes, it is annoying, and it's especially annoying to most monarchists because we're already a niche thing, and having what amounts to very naive people just giving the worst possible justifications for the Vine right in a very public manner does not help. So it probably it probably stings us more than it really is, because, like, at least I have yet to hear of, I don't fucking know, some mod in our monarchism Reddit being accused of sexual abuse. Like,
Yeah. Should we have the last question then? And then
yeah, and you know, and we've gone full circle because we started with Todd and now we're going to finish with Todd.
It all begins and ends in Portugal.
Yeah, or Scotland, as we like to call it. Yeah, so Todd, go ahead. What's your question?
How do you feel about kings against the idea of forming a monarchist political party? Because they may fear that the institution may involve in a partisan dispute or something like that.
Basically, the infamous question: if there is a monarchist party, why isn't the king a member of said monarchist party?
I mean, I think it ultimately hangs on risk management.
Yeah.
Yeah, because, you know, if you as a monarchist pretender, as a as a monarchical pretender, stake your claim on a particular party, you're you know, come hell or high water, you're now sort of tied to that party, and so you don't want to commit yourself until you have to a reasonable degree prove that that party is not LARP and cringed, as it were. Because your reputation, if you were to attach yourself to it, now stakes itself on that party. And also, it's often not that good optics, because it just, to a lot of outsiders, it could look like you're just doing it out of sheer self-interest because you have a fantasy about becoming king.
Also, often these kinds of political parties, at least historically, were like weird or whatever. I mean, the Action Française, Moreau was a like occultist, like spiritualist. Occult is the wrong word. He was a spiritualist, like he believed in magic and like communing with like spirits of the dead, which was pretty popular at the time. It was, however, not a good thing to be involved in if you're a Catholic, and so that was a big reason why the Orleanists didn't support it. Prior to that, obviously, for a long time, political parties weren't really like as much of a thing as they are now. Like,
And monarchy in itself, has had like a thing of being anti-party. That's often been one of its main drawing points.
yeah, anti-parliamentarianism is a big thing. I mean, I'm not all that opposed to it. I think if monarchists want to like put themselves forward, that would necessitate like some degree of support from kings. I also think kings now, at least, will probably be less opposed to it. Like I think there's a greater recognition now of like political party is a tool at the end of the day, and so it needs to be used responsibly, as it were. You don't take a hammer to a child, sort of thing. But I don't know if McCosk has more of an opinion on this though.
Yeah, the other thing is that political parties are often also kind of weird in terms of authority. Told you because he's Portuguese is more familiar with what I'm going to say, but this is also good. The Portuguese monarchist party that currently exists itself created brought back from the dead the dynastic dispute. Yeah, everyone was pretty much on board with the current claimant. Well, monarchists, that is, not the whole country. And apparently, the leader of the party at the time, for some reason, just had a fallout with the king and decided to just create a massive controversy in which he fished out a second claimant out of the blue, basically. The legitimacy is, I mean, the whole question about Portuguese dynastic legitimacy is hilarious on many levels, but he just brought another person onto the whole discussion for no other reason than he had a falling out with the king. So there's also a kind of notion that political party leaders are prickly and sometimes things don't go well. So there's also that it's like it's an unknown factor that sometimes backfires.
Yeah, I mean, it's risk management.
Yep. And I think that's it.
Yeah, that's pretty much it. So, yeah, thanks to
Excellent
everyone who
episode.
contributed.
Indeed.
And I'm sure we'll maybe do one of these again.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
I think that's
Yeah, so that's
good discussion,
night
really.
from us. Yeah, it's had a